So I was very excited when Jackie invited me to speak during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Excited to be with you all again, excited to worship with you all, many of whom I haven't seen since January. Some of you I saw last week. Some of you I've never met before. But I was excited to be with you all here today, and excited to talk about race and ethnicity, an issue that's very important to me. As I sat down to write, however, my overwhelming excitement quickly faded and faded and faded as my feeling of being overwhelmingly excited faded into feeling of being overwhelmingly overwhelmed at the idea of trying to tell the story of Asians in the US in one sermon. It's not an easy thing to do. And to be clear, and you all know this, there is no one common story that encompasses the experiences of all Asian Americans. And of course, that's true of any racial ethnic group. There is no one common story that captures the lives of African Americans or of Latino, Hispanic, Chicano Americans. There is no one story that encompasses the lives of white European Americans, or Native Americans, or Pacific Islander Americans, or people who are of mixed races and ethnicities. Each one of us has as individuals, we have a unique story about our own race and ethnicity. And each one of us has a unique understanding of how our story connects with the larger story of the heritages of our racial ethnic group or groups, right? So the term Asian has been developed over time by the US federal government primarily for administrative purposes, solely for administrative purposes, to count the number of people in the census or to track the number of people who are participating in governmental programs. And that definition has changed over time. What it means to be Asian has changed over time depending on what is going on politically in the country. So, for example, in Louisiana in the 1880s, in the 1880 census, children who had a Chinese father and a mother who was not Chinese, black or white usually, they were all classified as Chinese. But by the time the 1900s came around, these same children were reclassified in the census to be either black or white, depending on their mother's race. So the definition of what it means to be Asian has changed over time. The term Asian American was developed in the 1960s when Asians, people of Asian descent, were living in the United States, realized that they would have more political power if they worked together. Back then, in the 1960 census, Asian Americans made up 0.5% of the total US population. So it makes sense that they sought more power by coming together and working together. Today, or at least as of the 2010 census, Asian Americans make up about 5% of the total US population. Still not a large number, but that percentage is expected to grow over time, primarily due to the influx of more immigrants from Asia. Or at least those projections were made before January 2017. So putting aside census data, putting aside governmental definitions, what does it mean to be Asian? What does it mean to be Asian American? Is there such a thing as a pan-Asian identity? The more I reflect on these questions, the more I realize that forming a pan-Asian identity is not so much like putting together a patchwork quilt, like the quilts my grandma Tanaka used to make, where odd shapes of fabric in different colors and sizes and textures were carefully sewn together to create a unifying pattern on a rectangular piece of quilt. No, forming a Pan-Asian identity is less like putting together a patchwork quilt, and it's more like putting together a parade of banners. A parade of banners, of unique banners, with each banner its own unique shape and size and orientation. Each banner celebrating with its own colors and textures. Each banner not neatly folded and placed at the foot of a bed, but each banner flying in the wind, being seen from all angles and moving through space and time. Each banner tells a unique story, right? Because the Korean banner is unique from the Chinese banner, right? We know that. And the first generation Korean banner is even quite different from the second generation Korean banner, right? And the adopted into a white family first generation Korean banner is very unique from the not adopted first generation Korean banner, right? And to take this example one level further to explain the complexities, a grew up in New York City, adopted into white family first generation Korean banner, can in fact be very different from a grew up in Iowa City, adopted into white family first generation Korean banner. We watch as the parade of banners pass by, and we try to find themes, we try to find patterns, we try to discover common stories, we try to make sense of shared experiences. As the parade of banners passes by, we see some banners that are familiar to us. Oh, look, isn't that the Chinese men who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s banner? Yes, I think it is. And over there, isn't that the Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II banner? We know about that one. And coming up, is that the Vietnamese who were refugees after the fall of Saigon in 1975 banner? I think that might be it. Each of these banners tells a unique story, and each of these banners tells a very complex story. Like the story of Filipino men in the mid-1700s. At that time, the Philippines were under Spanish colonial rule, and many Filipino men were forced to join the Spanish Armada, forced to work on the long and treacherous trade route between the Philippines and Mexico. These men dreamed of a different life. They dreamed of living off the land and coming and going as they pleased. And so when the ship arrived in the port in Mexico, these Filipino men jumped ship. And they traveled around the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, where they eventually settled in the marshlands of Louisiana. Or stories like Korean women in the early 1900s. In 1910, Korea was under Japanese occupation, and these women were living in poverty, and they dreamed of a different life. They dreamed of a land, a nation, where their soon-to-be children could have access to education, where their children could have access to jobs. And they dreamed of a life where they could live out their faith as Christians. You see, they had been converted to Christianity by Presbyterian missionaries, and they had been told that America was a land where Christianity flourished. And so these women boarded ships. They decided to become picture brides, agreeing to marry men they had never met, boarding ships that would take them thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean until they eventually met their husbands-to-be on the plantations in Hawaii. Or stories like Punjabi men in the late 20th century who had good educations as chemical engineers and doctors, and who had access to good jobs in India, but who dreamed of a different life, who dreamed of a land where there were many more job opportunities and many new adventures. And so they signed up to and applied for work visas. And they left their families and began a new life for themselves and eventually for their families in New York City. Each of these people were seeking different things. The Filipino man was seeking escape from Spanish persecution. The Korean American woman was seeking to practice her faith in a land where she would not be punished for being Christian. And the Punjabi man was looking for new opportunities and new life and new adventures. Each of these people arrived on different paths through different gates, by jumping ship, by becoming a picture bride, by applying for a work visa. And yet, even though each of these people desired different things and traveled on different paths by different gates, they all arrived in the same place, America. Some of you may be thinking now, okay, thank you for the history lesson. But what does it have to do with me? We are all on a journey. We each have a story. And each of our stories tells of a unique journey. And we are each seeking different things, and we each arrived here in this place, in this church today, on different paths and by different gates. Maybe you are a Buddhist who really wants to sing with the gospel music. And so you have joined the gospel choir here. Or maybe you are a lapsed Roman Catholic who wants to feed the hungry. And so you volunteered to make sandwiches for our butterfly meal feeding program here. Or maybe you are a lesbian who grew up in the church, who grew up hearing hateful words from the pulpit, who at age 17 swore that you would never step foot in a church again. But you have been hearing interesting things about a church in the East Village that is welcoming and inclusive. And so you decide to check things out. We each desire different things, and we each have arrived here in this place on different paths by different gates, but we have all arrived here, the church. The church, a place of sanctuary, a place of welcome, a place of comfort, a place of healing, a place of spiritual, curious exploration, a place of learning. In our scripture reading today, Jesus says, I am the gate. Not like a gate, I am the gate. Anyone who enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. Jesus is the gate, the door, the portal. And in the arriving here, I believe that Jesus is not only the gate by which you arrived here today, and I also believe that Jesus is also the different gate by which you arrived here today. I believe that Jesus is the different gate by which I arrived here and the different gate by which you online arrived here today. I believe that Jesus is all the different gates that we each have entered by to arrive here today. And so, Jesus is our desire to sing gospel music. And Jesus is our desire to feed the hungry. And Jesus is our desire for community, for connection to something larger than ourselves. Jesus is the desire in our hearts to move closer and closer to our Creator. And Jesus is also the means by which we move closer and closer to our Creator. Jesus is the gate by which we move closer to the Creator. Now, after we enter by the gate, there's still a whole nother journey ahead of us. Some of us here would say that our journeys are just beginning, right? Like with the Filipino man, after they jumped ship, they still had to travel for hundreds of miles through marshes and woodlands and through forests. They still had to build houses built on sticks over the water in Louisiana. And they still had to deal with colonial rule, not from Spain, but from France. Or like the Korean women who, upon arriving in Hawaii, realized that the photographs in their hand were many, many years old. And that their husband-to-be was actually twice their age. And as they wrestled to understand how to create a new life in a strange land with a strange man as their husband. Or like the Punjabi man, who indeed did find more opportunities and new adventures in the United States, but who also found different challenges in the United States, like racial discrimination, where he was no longer seen as a Punjabi man, but as a brown person who talked funny. Where no one cared that he was Punjabi because he was lumped into a category with Bengali and Gujarati and Tamil people as South Asian. In the same way that the Punjabi man had to take on a new additional identity as South Asian. In the same way that the Filipino and Korean and South Asian had to take on a new additional identity as Asians. We, after passing through the gate, need to take on a new identity, an identity as the children of God, as the beloved. And after we pass through that gate, our journey continues as we journey together, the children of God, as toward a new land, toward pastures that are greener, toward a land with more opportunities, toward a world only of love, a world without discrimination, a world without racism, a world without sexism and homophobia and transphobia, a world without classism and ableism and ageism and all the isms. A world where hatred does not get the last word. A world where violence does not get the last word. A world where war does not get the last word. A world where oppression and deception and lie-telling do not get the last word. A world where evil does not get the last word. As we take on a new identity as the children of God, we will journey together. We will march together. We will work together. We will fight together toward a world where peace prevails, where justice and hope and reconciliation prevail, where love prevails, where the only word, the final word, is God's word, and that word is love. That word is love. That word is love. We have entered by the gate, and now we are being called. You and I are being called to receive the gift of a new identity. We are being called to take our banners and throw them into the air, freeing them to fly them in the wind. And we are being called to journey forward together as the beloved children of God. I pray that we answer that call.